Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, September 13th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Wisconsin and Marquette University Law School doing a poll as the gold standard poll for the state of Wisconsin, one of the most accurate pollsters in the entire state for any battleground state really across the nation, showing Kamala Harris in a very strong position heading into the final stretch of the 2024 election season. The recent poll that we found between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in this state shows Kamala Harris with a 4-point advantage against the former president. When you take a look at those who are voting in terms of at face value, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, she actually has a 5-point advantage. But when pushing leaners, meaning taking those undecideds and those people who say, I really have no opinion, and forcing them to make a decision, Kamala Harris still maintains an advantage of 4 points statewide at a whopping 52% in this battleground state. Now, to give context about Marquette University, they are one of the more accurate pollsters in the state of Wisconsin, and in the most recent election cycle, back in 2022, we found that they were nearly spot on in a state that many polls were simply inaccurate. We even saw that in the final stretch of the campaign season, we saw Ron Johnson maintain an advantage over Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. This is an advantage that averaged out to roughly 4 points according to Real Clear Politics, but only ended up being a 1-point victory. The closest pollster of this cycle was Marquette University, showing a 2-point advantage for Ron Johnson, and even then was an overestimation for Republicans. And taking a look at the 2024 cycle, with Marquette University showing Kamala Harris in this position, also stands in direct contrast with where Biden was in this battleground state right before we saw Joe Biden drop out of the presidential race. In fact, in Wisconsin, a lot of the data across the state showed Donald Trump in a better position against Joe Biden than compared to Kamala Harris. You can see that we saw Marquette University release a poll right before the debate showing a tie in the state of Wisconsin, which arguably was relatively good news for Biden. The average here had Trump ahead just slightly. In fact, in some instances, because of this Biden plus 6 poll from Quinnipiac, we saw Biden take the lead in the average, but still around this point, the tie was roughly even from what we had been seeing. And, Trump had led Biden by 2 points in a poll that they released back in April. I mean, they had done consistent polling across the state. They showed a tie back in January, and a lot of this really made sense. But with Kamala Harris on the ticket, a 4-point advantage is something that Democrats should be quite happy about because it reveals a lot about this battleground state and genuinely could provide additional context about the rest of the nation at large. Now, in dissecting some of the data from this poll, a lot of this has to do with favorability rating, how people perceive candidates like Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. When it comes down to her as a person, 51% of voters have an unfavorable view of Kamala Harris, whereas 47% have a favorable view. That's a lot better when compared to people like J.D. Vance, who have a 48% unfavorability rating and just a 37% favorability rating, a difference of negative 11 points on net, Kamala Harris being down just 4. And it gets actually worse with people like Joe Biden, who ends up being down 13 points across the state. There's a 4-point delta for Kamala Harris, a 13.1 for Joe Biden. But then you start to see something roughly similar. This is a reason why Donald Trump and Joe Biden both had those double haters that ultimately ended up opting for Donald Trump over Joe Biden, which was the real damage to the Biden campaign. 56% of respondents have an unfavorable view of Donald Trump. 43% have a favorable view of Donald Trump. Identical numbers to that of Joe Biden. And so to see Kamala Harris now outpacing both Biden and Trump, again, reiterates and hammers in that point that Kamala Harris is the more likable and more electable candidate for the Democratic Party. And that's what is driving her main support. Because Biden and Trump have roughly been even in terms of favorability rating across the state of Wisconsin. In some instances even, Biden was disapproved more than Trump in the state, which is a big reason why we really didn't see Donald Trump losing to Joe Biden in any of the Marquette University polls. Donald Trump had maintained an advantage, or at worst case, tied in this state. And if Donald Trump was tying in Wisconsin, chances are he was already picking up Arizona and Georgia and potentially some other battleground states. And so again, Kamala Harris's rebound for the Democratic Party in this state has largely been driven by the perception and the likability around her. When you take a look at how people really perceive Kamala Harris as a candidate, they perceive her as the Democratic nominee for president, but in a much more likable view because she isn't the person who is leading the country at this point. It's very clear that a lot of what Joe Biden is unpopular for is because of the past 4 years. It isn't just on a people-person type of scenario where people are saying, would I grab a beer with him? Would I see him that way? It is more about his job as president. And for Kamala Harris, luckily enough for her, there isn't as much association as you otherwise might see, and certainly not as much as if the candidate themselves was actually running for re-election. And so that's really where you're seeing Kamala Harris drive in these numbers and do quite well amongst leaners, amongst regular voters. This is all good news for Kamala Harris and really does build us out in understanding how the Rust Belt might vote, and again, how the rest of the nation might vote as response to the Rust Belt region. And when it comes down to the 538 polling average, on Real Clear Politics, Kamala Harris does have the advantage. You can see that she leads by, on average here, 1.8%. On 538, however, it's a 2.7% margin. And so this 3-point advantage is larger than Joe Biden's victory here back in 2020, which is also pretty good news for the Democratic Party. I mean, they can look at these numbers and say, we're on track for victory, but I never really believe that Democrats should be complacent. But what I do think is that it does provide additional context for Wisconsin and gives us a better understanding of what the polling landscape looks like currently, and could also provide insight as to why Wisconsin right now nearly a 2/3 margin chance of victory for Kamala Harris in this state, even though it is 10 electoral votes, it really does have a lot of national implications. And that's because Wisconsin is grouped into what we like to call the blue wall, the region of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania that have voted together in every election since 1992. And so these states really have decided to either vote entirely for Democrats, or in some cases for Republicans, like we saw in 2016 when Donald Trump was able to flip Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania for the first time in 24 to 28 years, depending on the state. And so these 44 electoral votes will likely vote together again in this upcoming election cycle, which is why it's good news for Kamala Harris if she's ahead in Wisconsin. And it isn't just that she's ahead in Wisconsin. When you take a look at a state like Pennsylvania, Kamala Harris maintains an advantage of around a point. In the state of Michigan, Kamala Harris maintains an advantage of around 2 points, which means Wisconsin is in fact the largest margin here for her. But when you look at the previous election results, it actually is quite surprising. But maybe in the context of this election, given that we have seen some support the Democrats have not been able to recapture amongst Muslim Americans in the state of Michigan. In the Dearborn region, the Arab American communities the Democrats rely on for victories right now isn't all on board with Kamala Harris. Far more on board with Kamala Harris than Joe Biden, but not near to the 2020 or 2016 numbers that we had seen in many elections past, right? And so 2024, I think Wisconsin does have this opportunity, especially with the Kamala Harris campaign, really honing in on this battleground state. This is 10 electoral votes the Democrats know they need to win because it drives a larger movement in favor of the Democrats, right? They know the same type of strategy and media buys and advertisements that work in Wisconsin will likely work in Michigan and Pennsylvania. You're talking about the Rust Belt, the white working class, the region of the country that Democrats historically have relied on as a baseline support level that Democrats now need to continuously fight for, and Kamala Harris is in fact fighting. Because these 44 electoral votes, if Kamala Harris is able to win them, all we have to do is characterize all of the states that Joe Biden won in the last election. It is as simple as that to help visualize exactly where we would be in a circumstance like this. We have the entire West Coast go blue, Virginia go blue, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada. If you take all of the states that Hillary Clinton won, if you take all of the states that Joe Biden won, with the exception of Georgia, Arizona, take those away, Kamala Harris wins the election. You can afford to lose Georgia and Arizona and states the Democrats are seriously fighting for, states like North Carolina and states that they might be fighting for given the massive amount of cash on hand that they have now, like Texas and Florida and Ohio and Iowa, states that used to be more competitive. Point being here, though, that if Donald Trump wins these states, it doesn't guarantee him the presidency. Even in a weird circumstance where Democrats lose a state like Nevada, there's still 270 electoral votes there for Kamala Harris to win the presidency through Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And that's why these states are just so incredibly important, because they do determine the balance of power. Because if they vote together in unison, they likely are landing Kamala Harris 4 more years in the White House, just in a different role. And so I think we really should start watching how some of these really strong polls dictate how Wisconsin goes. Tell us in advance, right? Again, Marquette University was the most accurate pollster back in 2022. And even when you're taking a look at the polling average here, while it may disagree with the average, a lot of this is being weighed down primarily by 2 singular polls, the Hill and Emerson College and then Trafalgar. Now, the Hill and Emerson College, I really don't take much problem with. I think they actually do have a very strong methodology and a good track record at that. But Trafalgar in specific is a Republican pollster that almost always severely overestimates Republicans. Looking back at 2022 in that cycle, their average overestimation for the Republican Party was 5 points. Their accuracy was amongst the lowest across the nation. And so 62% here, what we're finding is that Democrats in the state, many states, were far underestimated. They said Washington. While they did correctly get the winner here, I want to also caveat and say that based on what they were releasing, I don't even know if they should get the correct answer when it comes down to did you call the state right? Because in states like Washington State, yes, you heard me correctly, they said the Democrats were within 3 points of losing the Senate race there. That is not accurate whatsoever. Democrats were not within 3 points of losing the state of Washington. That's a state that Democrats ended up winning by a whopping 15 points across the state. So it was really interesting to see Trafalgar severely overestimate Republicans. And the fact is, this is one of Donald Trump's favorite pollsters. They routinely overestimate Republicans time and time again. They did so in the state of Wisconsin. You can take a look right before the election. They said Ron Johnson would win by 3, and it wasn't even just that too. You can take a look across these battleground states. Trafalgar was just completely wrong. You can see Trafalgar in Arizona. Masters +1 didn't happen. Lake +4 didn't happen, right? Take a look at Nevada Senate. Laxalt +5, he lost, right? A lot of these things just simply didn't happen. Trafalgar in Michigan's governor race. Tudor Dixon was supposed to win by 1. Guess what happened? The Democrats won by 10, right? So it is massively overestimating Republicans. Vance win by 10 happened that he won by 6. In North Carolina, Bud +6 ended up being Republican +3. And so if they are saying Trump is ahead by 1 in the state of Wisconsin, chances are it is correct in that Democrats do have the upper hand. Does that mean Donald Trump should write off Wisconsin? Absolutely not. But what it does mean is that Kamala Harris is likely right with this Marquette University poll that knows Wisconsin the best, in that they are saying Kamala Harris wins by 4, because that is truly where I think Democrats might be at this point post-debate with this surge of money, the surge of enthusiasm in the state. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be the result on Election Day. And so Marquette University being up in the advantage point for Kamala Harris, I think also speaks to this broader point that the Rust Belt region has started to turn even further away from Donald Trump compared to the 2020 election, and especially the 2016 election. Now, the 2020 election, the polls looked very different, and that's because the methodologies were still as incorrect as they were in 2016. Now, granted, they had fixed some things, and the fine-tuned tweaking ended up meaning that they were correct in the majority of races rather than wrong in the majority of races, at least the super competitive ones. But it doesn't mean that 2024, there wasn't room for growth for 2024, because there absolutely was. Democrats and Republicans came together across these firms and figured out what went wrong, because the polling firms really don't like to be wrong. Their credibility relies on accurate polling, right? Their credibility lies on the fact that what you see on Election Day is a lot closer to what you saw in the polls rather than a lot further. And so I'm reminded constantly that states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania far overestimated both Secretary Clinton and then Vice President Biden, because they clearly got something wrong in terms of methodology. But in 2022, a lot of the polls started to overestimate Republicans. I think a big reason for that is because after the realignment and after a post-COVID era, we did start to see polls miss the mark in favor of Democrats because they were missing a big chunk of voters for a variety of different reasons. But it wasn't just a COVID thing, right? After Roe v. Wade was overturned, the likely groups of voters, the people who were most likely to turn out to vote, ended up being more Democrat than Republican. That historically had never been the case. What we had known from the 2016 election and prior was that likely voters were most conservative, and regular voters or registered voters were more likely to be Democratic, which is why Democrats loved increased turnout. In 2022, in those special elections where turnout was very minimal, but those who were the most inspired to turn out to vote, Democrats really did well in those special elections. We even saw it here in 2024. In the Alaska primary, for instance, a state that Trump won by 10 points, Democrats got the majority of the vote in the first round of that primary. It doesn't mean that they've guaranteed themselves the House spot, but it means a lot better news for them than if this was to be a result of 40% or 35%, which might have been the case in years prior, where Democrats had not been at baseline inspired to turn out to vote. Which is why I also think, too, in the state of Wisconsin, you're seeing that amongst likely voters with Marquette, Kamala Harris does well. That voters do, in fact, respond to her positively in this battleground state. And again, could also drive up turnout if she's appealing to Wisconsinites by 4 points. She does the same in Michigan. She does the same in Pennsylvania. And that could translate, again, to down-ballot victories for Democrats. And, of course, that national victory that Kamala Harris desperately wants. As we track the national forecast here, too, I also want us to remember that these states very much have been moving together in a positive or negative direction for the candidates. I mean, even with a wide range of polling, what we have seen consistently is that there isn't a state like Pennsylvania, for instance, where Trump will be up by 6 and Harris will be up by 2 in Wisconsin. That's not how this works. Because they operate really as this unified body, you start to see some of the trends translate too. And so that means if Wisconsin's getting better for Kamala Harris, it's only a matter of time that Michigan and Pennsylvania do as well. And I can imagine with more campaigning, more money in this state, more investments, that is entirely possible. And a map like this becomes far more close to reality. And granted, I do think if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, she'll probably do it with a state like North Carolina and a state like Nevada, and it won't be just 270 to 268, but it'll be close. I think every single vote will matter, and every single level of impact and engagement in this race is going to determine the direct outcome of the presidency. And so as we track more data, I will be interested to see if Michigan and Pennsylvania follow suit. The good news for Kamala Harris is that one of the best pollsters in the entire state is saying that she is up 4 points amongst likely voters and up 5 on the overall average here. Really good results for Kamala Harris in a way that we just have seen many people really doom on her chances in some of these battleground states. But honestly speaking, the data out of Wisconsin is quite promising for Kamala Harris. It's something that she needs to maintain if she wants to win the election, but it completely negates any point that she is on path to lose this election, especially after that debate. She's in a good point. The question is, how does she capitalize on it and maintain it through November? So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server if you go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.